See you again. We're back here in Cherokee country. We're on the banks of the Illinois at No Head Hollow, and a couple hundred yards away is Highway 10. So you'll get to at least visually enjoy the background and audibly enjoy the road noise. But I'm here now with Sequoyah Guess, who is a member of the United Kituwa Band of Cherokee Indians. And he's a renowned storyteller and kind of a local hero in a lot of ways. He's a novelist too, and if you're lucky enough to find a copy of his work, you ought to grab it and hang on to it. So, Sequoyah, welcome. See you all.
Sure, what on, what on?
One thing that that we do know you are is a storyteller.
Mm.
And so I'm wondering if maybe you could tell us a little bit about storytelling in general. One of the questions that I had was about how maybe your model of storytelling differs from the kind of storytelling that we'd find in James Mooney's anthropology, his myths of the Cherokee. And then maybe if the mood strikes you, you could go ahead and launch into a story for us if you've got one on your mind.
Yeah, well, I always tell folks, don't believe everything you read in books, especially Mooney's book. Uh, there is so much that's off in that book, it's not even funny. I mean, a lot of the things
Now, wait a
that's
minute, I thought he was supposed to be an expert.
well, a lot of the things that he's written about or he wrote about, he had, he would talk to people about, different things. But a lot of times when you know about the thing that he wrote about, you realize that these guys that he was talking to were just making stuff up. You know,
You're just kind of pulling a fast one?
yeah, yeah, because I've heard it said, that they thought he was a funny man, because um, he would talk to somebody, and when they answer, he'd be right. And so a lot of times, uh, the people that he was talking to and writing about, they were just wanting to see him write, So they were just saying just about anything. Um, so that was their thing, where they just wanted to write. If you really read the Mooney book and you know the traditions and culture, you'll realize, that these guys were just leading him on, So, and it's true with some other books too, because a lot of the other books, um, they're just regurgitating what Mooney wrote.
We see a lot of that, it seems like.
Yeah,
Yeah, kind of became established as an authority in some way,
yeah.
and people turned to him just as that.
hmm And some of the stories that he wrote, the more traditional people, that's not how we learned them. He writes them in different ways. And then there's a lot of stories that we grew up with that Mooney never even touches on. There's one story that I tell nowadays that I tell people that it was almost lost. There was a wolf uh, that wore what he called shoes, but they turned out to be actually traps. Hastings Shade, Jagesa, and I were traveling around one day when he was running for deputy chief back in '98. I believe we were heading for Tulsa, and we were talking and everything. But then there comes a time, when things get quiet. And so that time came, and in that moment, I started hearing my grandma telling me the story about this wolf, and it was funny. And everyone, I'd start laughing while we was sitting in the car with Hastings driving. I'm sitting on the passenger side laughing every once in a while, and out of the corner of my eye, every once in a while, I'd see Hastings kind of looking at me, wondering what I was laughing about. But when I finished, or when Grandma finished telling me the story in my mind, I told Hastings the story, and he started laughing too. And he said he hadn't heard that story since he was a little boy.
Is that right?
And the same story I told at an elders conference in Oklahoma City. And when I was through telling stories, these two little old ladies came walking up to me, one kind of glassy eyed, like she had been crying. And even they told me they hadn't heard that story since they was little girls. And so if it hadn't been for Grandma coming back to me and telling me the story in my mind, that story would have been lost. And so
Okay.
I tell it every chance I get. And then other storytellers have picked up on it too, and they tell it too.
Oh
And so I'm glad they have. The difference between my storytelling and other people's storytelling is I do everything that Grandma did when she was telling me her stories. Well, if you can imagine, my grandma, skinny, you know, short lady, bandana on her head, and corncob pipe, and
yeah.
sitting in a rocking chair, uh, telling these stories in Cherokee, but changing her voice for each character. And so I do the same thing. I change my voice for each character when I'm telling the story, or the funny stories. And people seem to like that. And so that's one of the things that I do that most other storytellers don't. Another thing that I do is I try to put things in the story that people will relate to, which is the same thing that Grandma done. The example that I usually give is one time she was telling me a scary story about this man walking through the woods. Uh, he was looking for three sisters who were witches, and he was wanting to learn how to fly. And so they told him, you can only find their house at night by the glowing of the fire inside the house. And so he went out there, and he was carrying a torch to see by. Well, a few years went by, and then Grandma told me that story again. Same man, same three witches he's looking for, same wooded area that he's going through. But the torch had turned into a flashlight.
Uh-huh.
So she
Yeah.
she modernized it a little bit for
Uh-huh.
me, and
Right.
so I could relate to it better.
Hmm.
And so I do the same thing. I do a lot of modernizing to stories that I tell.
Hmm.
One story that I tell about rabbit and possum looking for wives. They leave their village and they start walking down the highway, just like that one up there,
Uh-huh.
and. Um, and so Rabbit and Possum, they're walking down the highway and they're dodging cars and everything. And in the story, just like in real life, Possum kind of slows so he gets hit and gets splattered out. And so, uh, but he's a medicine possum, so he fixes himself up and they take off again. When Grandma told me the story, it was a dirt road,
Uh-huh.
and the possum and rabbit, they were dodging wagons and horses,
Right.
and so nowadays I tell people they were dodging cars and
Yeah.
stuff. And so, in that,
They'll be dodging hovercraft before we
oh
know what
yeah,
happened. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I've said that before too. They'll be dodging hovercrafts. Um, but just like that, I modernize things in my stories so people, or especially the younger kids, will remember them, relate to them a little bit better.